Gosh, it's gotten quiet. Ow. It really got quiet. Good evening. Hello, thank you all for being here. My name is David Bodney, and it's my pleasure to welcome our guest this evening, David McCraw.
Thank you so much.
David is Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times, where he's worked since 2002. He provides legal counsel to the newsroom regarding libel, freedom of information, court access, litigation, and news gathering. Previously, he was Deputy General Counsel of the New York Daily News. He's adjunct professor at NYU School of Law and a visiting lecturer at Harvard Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Walter Cronkite School, David McCraw.
You know, Herm Edwards was here last Monday and then promptly lost on Saturday. So I'm not really looking forward to what's going to happen to one of my libel cases after this, but I'll take my chances. I'm hoping we can still win.
Well, I'm going to draw some questions from this marvelous book, and it's called Truth in Our Times by David, and there are copies here, lest I forget to tell you that they can be purchased and perhaps even signed.
Exactly.
And I learned from reading the book that you are a journalism graduate from the University of Illinois who worked at the Quad City Times in Davenport, Iowa. And in your book, you describe a scene when you were a small boy living in a tiny town reading the newspaper alongside your father. Two questions. What sparked your interest in journalism? And what led you to begin your illustrious legal career as a reporter?
Legal career, or was the second part about legal career? Or about...
Yeah, to start as a reporter and then go into law.
Okay. So you want to start with my failings. That's a really good place to start. No one cried the day I left journalism. Okay, I was a very mediocre sort of journalist. Always loved journalism, and I think that I have found my rightful place in journalism, which is as a lawyer, and that background was really helpful. I was talking about this with some students, that in many ways the skills of journalism are not that different from the skills of law. It's taking facts, it's synthesizing, summarizing, getting the right information, and explaining complicated subjects to people who may not be all that familiar with them. In my case, judges; in journalist cases, the audience. And so those things all work together. I actually had a lawyer from the CIA tell me that actually it was the same if you're a CIA agent. So if you're looking for any careers, journalism, a lawyer, CIA agent, they apparently all have the same skills. But my journalism background obviously helps a great deal in everything that I do for the New York Times. I understand how journalism is done. I have a good ear for how it's written. So when I make suggestions to change a story, when I'm doing a review, I can talk in a way that sort of sounds like journalism, which is really helpful. But a lot of times the issue is really sort of how did I ever come to be, there comes the alarms. So unless we're going to get blown away by the storm, I'll continue. So people ask me a lot about how I became a First Amendment lawyer, how I got interested in the First Amendment. The thing I really want to stress, because I think it's important, is that I did not become a lover of the First Amendment walking the streets of Manhattan. I became a lover of the First Amendment back home in Monticello, Illinois, a tiny, tiny conservative town in Illinois, 4,000 people on a good day. My parents were very patriotic, conservative Americans. My mother was a veteran. My father was a veteran of both of World War II. And when you're a kid like me, growing up in Illinois in the 1960s and 1970s, there's really only one thing you know about politics, just one thing, and that is the governor goes to jail. So when I was a kid, Governor Otto Kerner went to jail. Governor Dan Walker went to jail. The third guy got off, so if anybody's here from the law school, hats off to the lawyers in the crowd. When the Secretary of State died, when the Illinois Secretary of State died, his office was filled with shoeboxes of money. My parents, their generation, those conservatives understood that it's a great thing that we have a free press because the government's going to steal from you, and maybe having a free press will stop that.
So as a small boy, though, growing up in Illinois, journalism sunk in. It took root.
Well, I did read the Decatur Herald, which is one of the really distinguished papers of our time. No, it did. And my father was a big believer in news, and there was something very great in those days because when local journalism was really strong, we had a morning paper and we had an afternoon paper, and there was actually competition among the papers in the area. All of that's gone now.
Your book is subtitled Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. Is the fight for press freedom different today in the age of alternative facts than it was in the past, say, in the age of the Alien and Sedition Acts, or in times of war, or during Watergate? And if so, how is it different?
In fairness, I may look old, but I don't actually remember the Alien and Sedition Act, which from 1801.
When you said you grew up at Monticello, I just assumed.
Right. So here's the difference. That's a good question. I think when you talk about those eras, for the most part, what people were concerned about was government control through law of the press, or oppressive laws about libel. So censorship during the wars, censorship and the right of government to censor during the Alien and Sedition Acts during that period. And then, of course, as you march into the 50s and up to Times versus Sullivan in 1964, the concern was, will the libel laws be used by people in power to intimidate, to bankrupt, to control, to essentially suppress truth? It was very much a legal focus, whether that legal threat was from the government or the way our libel laws work. And as I say in the book, I think the real threat to press freedom today is a hearts and minds problem. That what I see as the real fight is that there has been an all-out war to try to discredit the press through statements like fake news and enemy of the people and journalists as committers of treason. And what concerns me more than it's being said is I think it's actually getting traction. And that while I was writing my book, the polling agency Ipsos came out with a poll where 26% of the respondents said the president should have the right to shut down news organizations that misbehave. Now, whatever you think about the press, whether you think press is doing a good job or a bad job, I can assure you the writers of the First Amendment never thought that there should have been a footnote on the First Amendment that said, but if the press screws up, the president gets to shut them down. That was never part of the plan. So it concerns me because I do think that, as I say in the book, a disbelieved press is not that different from a shackled press that we see in other countries. If the press is not believed, it loses the one thing that gives it its power, which is to move public opinion, to serve as a check on government, to make citizens aware, and then to have them act.
So in your book, you pose the question, can the press play the role of honest broker again, as it did during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, or has something fundamental changed in the nature of the American press and public? Which is it?
Too soon to tell, is that the answer? You know, it occurred to me as I was writing the book that if you look at Watergate and the civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam, times of great stress and trauma for this country, the press played an incredible role in sort of raising the truth about those events and helping form a national consensus. There was the president had to go, the war had to end, or we needed to be a fairer country in the civil rights movement. And my hope is that that's still a role the press can play, but the depth of the division, the amount of polarization, I think makes it very difficult. And I think the overlay of the internet and the amazing amount of information out there, the amazing amount of hate speech and falsity and fake news and all that other stuff, that makes it very difficult to be a citizen in this country right now and know what to believe, I think creates an opportunity for what I'm going to call the mainstream press, the legacy media, to be a voice that you can trust. But at the same time, I understand why people are skeptical. There's just so much out there that sort of flows through society without any regulation, and to find that people are growing cynical or apathetic isn't surprising.
So it's harder to play the role of honest broker today than ever before?
Well, it is harder, and I think that the press has to own a little bit of that. I think that we at times have not done a great job in explaining what we're doing and how we are doing it and why we're different than what you're seeing on Facebook. You know, in the book, I talk about Ev Williams, one of the founders of Twitter, who said that the internet's just broken. He says it's just broken, and the reason it's broken is this, and it goes back to the old thing about gawking at automobile crashes. You're driving down a road, there's a crash on the other side of the highway, you can't do anything about it, we all still slow down and look at it. And he says that's what the internet is about. It's about attention, and what it rewards is attention, and that means the pressure is always to be the most spectacular, to the most outrageous, the most extravagant. It does not reward quality, and it does not reward truth, and that's why you end up where we are. And I make the point in the book that that's very different from what I call media landscape 1.0, the way it worked at the time of Watergate or the civil rights movement, Vietnam War, where you essentially had the mainstream media as a gatekeeper, right? The national agenda was set by CBS News and Newsweek magazine and the New York Times. They made a decision about what was news. The public saw that, and we came together to focus on those things that became part of the agenda. But, you know, you now see all of this information that flows without any gatekeeper, and sometimes that's a really, really valuable thing. The example I use in the book is this. Some of you will remember that do you remember this? The guy on United Airlines is overbooked, and they drag him down the aisle, right? You know, kind of incredible, wasn't it? You know, and think about how that would have happened in the old day, right? In the old days, whoever was on that plane when it landed would have had to go to a payphone or something, and would have to call a newspaper and say, here's what happened on this airplane, you should report it. And an editor would have to decide whether it was a story. And then a few days later, after it had been reported out, it may be published or not. That was what it was to have old-time gatekeepers. That's how it used to work. Now, that story is instantaneous. That story is instantaneous, right? Everybody knows about it, you know, and it helps. It changes the way the airlines work. I was on a flight not long after that, flying from Los Angeles back to the East, and right after that happened, and I'm sitting there, and the flight attendant comes out and says, we're overbooked. And she sounds like a professional hostage negotiator, right? And you start seeing people starting to pull out their cell phones, somebody's going to be dragged. She goes, no pressure here, okay? Well, that's positive to get that kind of message out very quickly. But the flip side of that is we pay a very high price with all the information that's just flowing through society every minute.
So when the president declares the press to be the enemy of the people and calls mainstream news organizations like the Times and the Post and CNN to be the purveyor of fake news, how does that alter the media's coverage of the administration?
It shouldn't. Okay, it shouldn't, and I'm hopeful that in large part it doesn't, but it's very hard to find yourself being part of the story. And we have really worked at that at the Times. Do we always get it right? I'm sure we don't. That while you're being attacked, you need to write about the attacks. While you're being attacked, you need to write about the people who are doing the attacks. It can be discouraging. But I think for the most part, we have succeeded most days in keeping our eye on the ball. It's one of the reasons why it's important for someone like me who's not involved in covering the White House, covering Congress, covering the presidential campaign, to be out speaking about these issues. Our journalists should be doing journalism. It's why it's important for our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, to do the same thing. Earlier today, there was published an op-ed that he wrote about the problem of covering foreign news, of covering international news in an age when the press is under attack in the United States. Very important essay, and part of a speech he's giving at Brown University tonight, I think. So those of us, who are in news organizations and have the opportunity to speak out, have to speak out. It's very important that journalists keep doing their job.
And yet, as the newsroom lawyer in your book, you describe yourself as agnostic on questions of fairness. Can you describe what that means? Yeah,
so one of the things, just so you understand, if I could level set here about how it works, is that if you're in my position, one of the things you do that's important, it's not a big time-consuming part of the job, but it's important, is journalists send their stories to me to review before publication. The idea behind that is that I should be looking at it to do what I can to make sure that the story is not likely to lead to a libel suit. Still may lead to a libel suit, can't stop people from suing, but I want to make sure that we've done all we could to tell the truth and do it in a way that comports with the law. One of the things I find very, very useful in doing that is to always be thinking of what's the counter narrative? The person who's being attacked in this story, or who's looking bad in this story, who's being criticized in this story, how does it look from that person's point of view? And whether that is Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, and during the last campaign, I kept flipping back and forth. I think it confused the journalists. There I was standing up for Trump when he was being criticized. There I was standing up for Hillary when she was being criticized. Couldn't I get my mind wrapped around this and get my story straight? But it was important that whoever was there, that I was the one who was asking the hard questions. And usually I found that the journalists had thought about this, but you can imagine when we're doing a story about opioids, and you see the coverage of Purdue Pharmaceuticals and the Sacklers, we see the coverage of Harvey Weinstein. I felt like a lonely voice some days saying, did we get this fair? Did we do what we can? At the end of the day, though, David, and you know this from your own practice, the lawyer's not really the fairness police. The lawyers are fact polices. We want to get it right, and that the decision about perspective and fairness ultimately resides with the newsroom. That said, we all know, too, having dealt with libel suits, that if there is unfairness, if there's a sense of unfairness in the story, it plays very badly in the litigation. The people say, well, look, you were unfair, that's why you got it wrong. And so I will press back on Times to make sure that we have done as balanced a story as we can.
And you recognize in your book that libel lawsuits seem to be on the uptick over the last couple of years. There's some big verdicts, large settlement amounts, oligarchs suing to reclaim their reputations. Is there a trend? Is there something we should be aware of that's happening out there?
I'll push back a little in that I think that there was initially, after the election, some libel suits brought by people on the right that I wouldn't have expected. It didn't really work out for them all that well in most of the cases. And I think that more recently we have seen some libel suits that are brought again by people who have issues with the New York Times or journalists or any of that. But by and large, libel is still not one of those things that has been a huge problem for us. I think most people think that it's a much bigger problem than it is. Over the last 10-year period, that is from 2008, the 10-year period ended in 2018, okay? So over the last 10 years, the Times has had 16 libel suits brought against it. Now, 16 in the United States, 4 overseas, but 16 in the United States. If you think about it, 16 libel suits over a 10-year period, given all the content we have out there, podcasts, video, graphics, print stories, 16 is an incredible number. And we as a company have had a policy that we don't settle libel cases by paying money to defendants. And at the same time, it's been decades since we lost a libel case. And so I think our no settlement policy has helped drive down the number of libel cases. But the important point is this, is that I really think that the libel tail shouldn't wag the journalism dog. Okay. What's important is I don't want. Maybe it's that lawyers should be rarely heard and rarely seen. But one of the great things about living in this country is there is so much press freedom. We do a disservice when we as lawyers make journalists nervous or frightened or scared. They should understand that the whole drift of the law for the last 55 years has been, let's have an aggressive press. Let's go do the hard stories. The law will protect you.
And speaking of which, you have brought more Freedom of Information Act cases than any other newsroom lawyer in America. So why is litigation to obtain public records, public information, important? And how do you decide to sue for a DOJ memorandum authorizing CIA drone strikes in Yemen or Donald Trump's divorce papers?
Well, one of those worked out. We now know how the U.S. was able to do drone strikes in Yemen. We still don't know about the Trump divorce, but maybe someday. Look, our view is that it's very important that the federal government be held to the letter of the law. Some of you who have done this understand how FOIA works, and that is any citizen, journalist, citizen, doesn't matter, writes a FOIA request, it goes into the government, a FOIA officer at an agency, it asks for records. A FOIA officer at an agency then either has to give you the records or give you a reason why you don't get records. The process is very slow. It doesn't matter what the statute says. It can take weeks and months and years to get a response. And in many cases, the agency says no. We're not going to give you those documents for these legal reasons. And it occurred to me at some point that if what happened at that point was the citizen, the requester, shrugs and says, well, that kind of sucks, but I guess I just don't get any records, and walks away, we're leaving federal bureaucrats to decide how transparent the government is. The only tool we have is to take it to court and have a judge make that decision. Has the government lived up to the law, or should they have given us more documents? And so we became very aggressive in doing this. The numbers are pretty staggering that in the Obama administration, we filed more than 30 FOIA suits. Our peer group, mainstream media peer group, had done 10 collectively, all of them combined. In the Trump administration, we've done at least 27 at last count. We just keep filing. But let me tell you one story which really, I think, underscores why it's important to do. I wrote a column the other day in the Times about FOIA, and I began with this anecdote because I thought it illuminated why we are so zealous about this. One of our reporters had filed a FOIA request with a government agency, and the request asked for documents showing whether government expenditures had aided certain Trump properties, expenditures on road repairs, expenditures on security, expenditures on whatever. Very straightforward. We're just trying to find out what the government had done. And we got the standard denial letter from the agency, which says, dear requester, you requested these documents, and we're not giving them to you for the following legal reasons. And if you're unhappy with that, you can appeal to my boss, and here's my boss's address, and that's it. It's a very standard form letter you get when your FOIA request is denied. But here was not standard. Somebody in the FOIA bureaucracy had put an anonymous note at the back of it. They had dropped into the envelope, whoever this was, had dropped into the envelope a printed message, unsigned, that says, this was totally political. You are not being treated fairly. This was a decision made by higher-ups. It's not legal, and you should sue. So we like good citizens like that. If you know people in government who are willing to do that, encourage them to continue doing that. But it just reminded me that my basic instinct was right, which is that as conscientious as many FOIA requesters are, or FOIA officers are, that every pressure within an agency is to say no to giving us documents. So we press on.
I've actually seen a similar kind of enclosure from someone in government. It's interesting, yeah.
Good citizens inside our government, that's a good thing.
Yeah. So now you have wrestled with some difficult decisions on whether to publish, like WikiLeaks cables and the Snowden disclosure, James Risen, Eric Lichtblau's reporting on government surveillance in the Bush era. You say this in your book. So what made you think the decision to publish Donald Trump's tax returns would be easy? Well, just define easy. Okay. These are all cases which I think that the law is very supportive of the right to publish. When we get to, let's put national security aside for a minute because that's a hard case and a case that's getting harder. But one of the things that I think is hard for many people to grasp is that when we get information from a source and we've done nothing wrong to get it, we have the right to publish it under the First Amendment. Okay, so even if the person who gave it to us committed a crime to get the information, even if the person who gave it to us is committing a crime by giving it to us, as long as we were not involved in the wrongdoing, we didn't hack, we didn't break into anybody's voicemail, we didn't steal the documents, we didn't have anybody steal them for us, as long as we are a recipient of it, it becomes an easy legal call that we have the right to do that. Now, let's put national security aside for a minute. And so the Trump tax returns seemed like a pretty easy call legally. Just to remind people what happened, in October of 2016, New York Times reporter Sue Craig goes to her mailbox at the New York Times. There is a plain envelope, and inside the envelope are three pages from the tax returns of Donald Trump from 1995
20 years earlier. And it's just there. And of course, that had been the huge issue, right, in the campaign. Is Trump going to release his track return? You know, and he says he would, and then he says he might, and then he says he won't. And here they were. And I sat with the reporters initially, and we were looking at this, at the tax returns. And here's the irony of this scheme, right, is that legally, that's a great case, right? That's the best way legally to receive the documents. There's no wrongdoing by the journalist unless you think going to your mailbox is wrong. They just came. On the other hand, that is the worst way journalistically to get them, right? Are they real? Are we being set up? And the reporters and I sat there, and they were trying to think of ways they could confirm the numbers. Very hard to think about where are we going to find out how to confirm those numbers. And one of the problems with it was that there was one funky number, and that was the loss. That's all. I tell this story in the book, that where it had Trump's loss, it had a figure that was $915 million of losses. And when you looked at that $915 million of losses, the 91 didn't quite line up with the rest of the number. It looked funky. And it concerned us, like, did someone make this up? And then our reporter, David Barstow, did an amazing job of reporting. He finds out who Trump's accountant was 20 years earlier. And he finds out that he's still alive and that he's living in a retirement village in Florida. And David goes down there and convinces Jack Mitnick to come out of his retirement village, out through the gated community, and look at these pages. He offered him coffee and bagels, so you guys should remember that if you're journalists in training. Always work, coffee and bagels. And Mitnick looked at it and said, yeah, that's the real deal. Those are the actual documents, because that number was so big, my software couldn't reproduce it. So I had to type it with a typewriter, and that's why the 9 and 1 didn't line up. So we knew we had it. The reporters did an incredible job on it, kind of what it meant, and the fact that maybe Trump hadn't paid taxes for 20 years. We decided to do the story, and as you can imagine, candidate Trump's lawyers start writing to us, you're breaking the law, you know, this is illegal, you know, you're participating in a crime, all wrong. And so I don't have any doubts about that, so I say, sure, go ahead and publish it. The next day, I'm at a Yankee game, and Sue Craig calls me. She was the one who got it. And Sue says, you know, calls me at the Yankee game and says, have you seen the Washington Post? Sue's Canadian, so I have to explain to her, at baseball games, we don't read the Washington Post. It's just a thing, okay? We should never have taken that team out of Montreal. So anyway, so I look at it, and the Washington Post says that the Times risks legal jeopardy by publishing the tax returns. And everything about that story was wrong from the headline down. And it concerned me that the Washington Post, which benefits from the law every single day, didn't really understand it. And people were tweeting it. My phone was ringing. I was getting emails. Finally, 2 days later, the New York Times did a story about the law in our publishing. And I'm thankful because I was allowed to keep my job. The New York Times agreed with me that I was right, that we had the right to publish that. But the beautiful thing is what happened the next day. Because the next day, Fox News published a story about whether it was legal and agreed with the New York Times. In this country today, if the Fox News and the New York Times both tell you you're right, okay? You are absolutely right. That's the one thing you can count on. This national security thing is harder, right? I mean, is that same rule apply to national security secrets?
Well, your newsroom broke a number of important stories about Harvey Weinstein and what has come to be known as the Me Too movement. You wrote a brilliant brushback letter to candidate Donald Trump's lawyer when he threatened to sue the paper over its article titled, "Two Women Say Donald Trump Touched Them Inappropriately." How are those stories unique, or different from the other stories that require close legal review?
Yeah, so one of the things that's been my good fortune as a lawyer is to be at the center of the newspaper that has really broken the Me Too stories and essentially, I think, done the kind of reporting that's leading to a much fairer deal for women in the workplace, and I am very proud of that.
Hear, hear. Yeah.
And the legal part of this is fairly discreet, and I'll give you the proof of that. Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, who wrote the Harvey Weinstein story, have a new book out called She Said, came out last week. Their story, which recounts their reporting, really good for anybody who's in journalism to get that book. You know, it's a full book about the reporting. I have one chapter. That's about right. You know, the legal stuff is about one chapter worth. The reporting's a whole book.
It was likened to All the President's Men for the Me Too movement.
Yeah, I think that's right. So here's let me begin with Harvey Weinstein, then come back to Donald Trump. You know, the Weinstein story was fascinating because it was an open secret in Hollywood. Reporters had attempted to get at it, and nobody had. And so, as I talk about in the book, Jodi Kantor calls me and says, we're going to start doing this story on Harvey Weinstein, and it's really incredible what he's done to women, and we're sure to get sued. And as often happens in the book, I'm completely wrong in my predictions, and I sort of think to myself, this is not going to be that big of a problem. We're going to report that some anonymous women say this happened. Harvey Weinstein's going to say it didn't happen. We're going to get angry lawyer letters. I'm going to write back, and that's going to be the end of it, you know, and maybe Harvey will pull his advertising for a while. But of course, the brilliance of that reporting was getting people on the record, getting confirmation of things, and making the case in such a way that it finally dawned on Harvey, it was over. It was over. And in the aftermath of that, I would get calls from lawyers because we would be doing a story about somebody in the arts or somebody on Wall Street or somebody in other industries, and we were about to do a story about somebody's abuse of women. And every lawyer who called me always said the same thing, David, which is, my guy is no Harvey Weinstein. Okay, like that was the standard. Like, oh, okay, yeah, if you're not Harvey, you know, it's okay to abuse as long as you don't do it at the Harvey Weinstein level. And I just explained to them, you know, the world had moved on, and no one was calling and saying it was false. No one. It was really kind of a plea to go back to a world where we looked the other way. The Trump letter, which pushed me into the forefront of this in a way that was a little uncomfortable at first, was a different matter because he was running for office. To remind you of how this unfolds is that in October of 2016, we had the Hollywood tape with his comments to Billy Bush. The whole issue of how he treats women had sort of become the campaign issue. On a Sunday night, he debates Hillary Clinton, and the issue comes full force into the front of the debate again. The following Tuesday, I get a call from a reporter saying, we're about to do this story, can you look at it? And the story said that two women claimed to have been groped by Mr. Trump many years earlier. And their allegations seemed really credible, and that was important to me. But what was really important to me was that this story really gave you a chance to understand and assess for yourself as a reader whether you wanted to believe it. Talked about how much time had passed. It talked about how they hadn't reported these incidents. Donald Trump was quoted in there, and so. To me, the more journalism is transparent about what we did, how we got the story, the better off we are, who the sources were, and so forth. And so I had no doubts about that. In the midst of a presidential campaign, that was a story that needed to be told. people needed that information, and they could make their own judgments about it. The Trump campaign disagreed with me rather vehemently, and so the next day they started announcing that they were, that they were going to sue the New York Times. They were going to sue the New York Times for running this story, and the people are picking up on it on talk radio. The newscasts are leading with it, and at Wednesday night at about 8 o'clock, we still haven't seen anything, and then I hear from our PR person saying she's heard that the Trump campaign is going to sue us that night, which was really weird, right? Because one thing I know as a lawyer is you need to have a court that's open to sue somebody, okay? And the only court I knew that was open was the Bronx Criminal Court, and they see some really weird things in the Bronx Criminal Court in the middle of the night, but not too many libel suits from presidential candidates. So in the end, they in fact wrote a letter, and I responded to that letter, and they had posted their letter on the internet. We responded in kind, and I then had my 15 minutes of internet fame, which is about 14 and a half minutes longer than anybody needs.
It was a great letter.
Thank you.
Yeah, great letter. Well, and on another serious note, you've had more than your share of late nights worrying about the safety of reporters in harm's way. You've dealt with kidnappings of more than one reporter in Afghanistan, and you've become a source for lawyers and newsrooms when it comes to safety and security in hostile environments. What advice would you impart to reporters when it comes to news gathering in hostile environments? And might you define hostile environments these days more broadly than war zones?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff in there, David. I mean, the world is a much coarser place than it used to be. So let's start with international coverage. When I started at the New York Times, there would be occasions when a reporter would be rolled up by some young soldiers representing some rebel movement, and by the time I got involved, the reporter would be free because some more senior commander would come along and hit somebody up beside the head and said, "What are you doing? We don't arrest, we don't detain journalists," because they needed journalists to tell their story. They needed journalists to help them get their message out. And then Twitter came along, and Facebook came along, and Instagram came along, and they no longer needed journalists to tell their story. And so what happens is then the journalists' real value is as hostages, as kidnapped victims. It's a way to raise money or to gain attention or whatever it might be. And we run smack dab into that in 2008, 2009, and on, as we saw with the tragic killing of Jim Foley and others in Syria by ISIS. What that's meant is we've completely changed the way that we operate. It used to be that it was part of the daring do of being a foreign correspondent that I went into the war zone and nobody heard from me for 3 or 4 days and I came out with the story. That doesn't happen anymore. We need to know where our people are. We need to be able to respond to that. We're ready to provide rescue if need be, and I'm proud that since 2011, we have not had any of those kind of incidents again, and it really required a change in the culture and the way we did business. But of course, as you're suggesting, it's now a problem in the United States. The number of threats that come in, and we, in the last 2 years, we've hired a security director. We have a 24/7 threat line for our reporters where they can report the threats. We have barricades outside our building to block against car bombs, and it is just an entirely different environment. And especially for female reporters, every day is a almost constant assault through Twitter and so forth with hateful speech. Most of that is just that. It's somebody trying to feel macho sitting in front of a computer. It's the person's never going to act on the threat. But they don't tell you. They don't tell you which ones are real and which ones are not. I was talking to one of the classes today, and on what I see is both a the culture of all this. Guy sends a note in and he thinks he's really being clever. He writes this email, and he's going on and on about, oh, I walked by your building today, and it doesn't look like your security is that great. I'd hate to have anything happen to you. It would be terrible if you got hurt for all the lies you're telling, blah, blah, blah. So it's done like that. And he obviously thinks he's really being clever. And he's so caught up in his own cleverness, he forgets that his signature block's at the bottom of the email. Yeah. So it takes me about 75 seconds to find out where he works, and I write him an email under the Ray line stalking and threat and say, I need to speak to you immediately. And of course, my signature block, I intentionally left there, so he knew it was a lawyer writing. And I get this, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm 70 years old. I would never hurt anybody. I won't come to New York again. I will never come by your building. This will never happen, and so forth. You know, he doesn't really change things. You know, people were scared by what he had to say. And as much as many of these are never going to turn into real threats, next month in Boston, there will be the sentencing of a man who threatened who gave death threats, sent death threats to the Boston Globe. And the FBI found him. The U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuted him. It turned out, once we saw the threats, that we had received them too. And it's good work by the U.S. Attorney's Office, good work by the FBI to do it. But I really am concerned by any journalist who decides to put in a victim impact statement, who decides to say, this is what it felt like to be threatened by that guy, because they rightfully should fear that that will just make them a target again. That is a very discouraging note to end on. Do you want to say upbeat things?
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a good time. I'd like to save one or two questions, but to open it up to our audience, if anyone has a question for David McCraw.
We so stunned them.
Well, would you like to come up here to the mic so we can all hear you? Thank you. Come on around.
So, my name is Lilia, and I'm a Cronkite student. What can you recommend for aspiring journalists who are studying? What can they prepare for when they get into the journalism world?
So what can journalism students do to prepare themselves to be journalists? Yeah. And fortunately, as a lawyer, I can only tell you what I see from my side of the world. But the young journalists that I admire and would encourage show the same things that were true when I was a failing journalist, back when I was in journalism school. The people who were much better at than I, persistence and fairness, that the ability to just continue to stay with a story and to keep asking questions, and then to report against yourself, that if you think you have the story, try to disprove it. Because if you try that, and the story stands up, you know you have it right. I can't stress enough how much those two things, fairness and persistence, really matter. Thank you.
Other questions?
So you kind of just answered it, but I was wondering how you got into this type of law.
Yeah, it was, like most of my life, random. The question, in case for those who didn't hear, was how I got into this area of law. I had a very unusual career path. I didn't go to law school till I was 34. I was one of the oldest kids in my law school class. And what had happened was I had been a journalist for a while, and then I started teaching journalism, and I was much better at teaching it than doing it. And I was teaching and loved teaching journalism, loved everything about it. But I realized that I was never going to go anyplace without an advanced degree. My dean said, you know, you could get a PhD, but it would really help us more if you got a JD. That would help round out our program. This is at the college I was teaching at. So I went off, as I tell my law school students, I was actually sent to law school. They don't have that excuse. They actually volunteered to be there. I was sent by my dean to go to law school. I really loved it. You know, I was at an age where to be a student again was incredible. And so I told the people at my college, Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, that I wasn't going to come back. They were so great. They said, well, you know, continue teaching as long as you can, but we support you. And so I went to law school and taught for the next 2 years, graduated. And I never really thought, even though I had a background in journalism, I never thought I would get into this area. It's a very narrow area. I didn't think there were a lot of opportunities, so I was a fairly straightforward commercial litigation type attorney at a big law firm in New York. We did an occasional media case, but through that, I got a job at the New York Daily News, which was the first in-house job I had. And I got that in part because they wanted somebody who could do the media law part of it, but also could do the commercial law part of it. And then I was very fortunate when a job opened at the New York Times. Adam Liptak, who some of you may recognize from his byline, who now covers the Supreme Court for the New York Times, had my job before me and had decided he wanted to be a journalist. And I was already deep in working in press law by then at the Daily News after 2 years. And I was able to make the transition. I'll say this, you know, for those of you who don't know New York journalism, the Daily News is a tabloid, a lot of celebrity coverage, a lot of crime coverage, and very aggressive, very blue-collar type paper. A great place to learn how to be a lawyer, how to be a press lawyer. And one of the reasons I got the job at the New York Times was that there were reporters at the Times who wanted to sue the city of New York over their records from 9/11. 9/11 had occurred, right? And there were reporters who really wanted to understand more about how the rescue operation took place. And because there was a concern that a lot of people, what an heroic effort by the police, what a heroic effort by the fire department, but did their supervisors really know what they were doing? And we wanted to get at those reporters wanted to get those records. And I think that the New York Times sort of felt reluctant. I mean, should we really be suing the city of New York at this time when feelings are so raw? And so they asked me that, would I be willing to bring a suit against the city of New York? I was from the Daily News. That's what we did. We sued the city. We didn't know any better, like, why wouldn't you? And so it was a great opportunity for me because we brought that suit, and 3 years later, we largely won it. And it was an incredible insight into what happened on 9/11 when we got those documents. It took a long time, but it was worth it.
Remember those stories?
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
I'm a retired lawyer. I retired from Ballard Spahr, as a matter of fact, 5 years ago. And I've just started my journey into journalism as a journalism student. And I find what's happening in journalism today alarming. Jarrett William Smith was arrested today by the FBI for making bomb threats. I'd like to know what your thoughts are with respect to whether what we're seeing today in terms of violence threatened to journalists or their institutions, whether you think that would have happened in any event. Were we headed in that direction before this 2016 election, or is it really an outcropping or an outgrowth of what we see in the administration?
I think it's a very good question. It's very hard to do cause and effect on this. We live in a time when people speak in uncivil ways to each other generally. But I think I don't think I can, look the other way, that the president's rhetoric has contributed to it. I don't think he caused it, but I think he normalized it, that, if the president of the United States saying that the New York Times, the NBC News, CBS are enemy of the people, why wouldn't someone act on that and treat them like the enemy of the people? And I think that's unfortunate, because I don't think that any president has to love the press, and I certainly understand why President Trump has his disagreements with the press. Jimmy Carter said he'd never seen a president treated more unfairly. I don't know if that's true or not, but if Jimmy Carter sees it, I think we should all take a moment to think about that. But that is still not a reason to engage in this orchestrated campaign against the press, because it does create a toxic environment. It's also, I think the whole labeling of fake news is a particularly toxic event for society, because it's kind of brilliant, right? When somebody says something's fake news, it sounds like something somebody would say in The Pursuit of Truth, right? When it's really just the opposite. It's encouraging people to label and dismiss rather than to read and discern. And I think that undermines democracy at a very fundamental level. But here's the point I make in the book, and that if I could have an optimistic moment. When I first started doing this, one of the great things about it was liberals and conservatives agreed that freedom of the press was a good thing, right? Everybody kind of agreed on that. And now to see it as a polarizing issue is concerning, but we're not that far away from a time when people shared that belief about the importance of a free press. In 2010, Congress passed its most important libel law, which was called the Speech Act. The details of it are not all that important, but essentially it was passed because Congress was concerned that U.S. publishers were being sued overseas by Russian oligarchs and Saudi financiers of terrorism and other human rights violators. They were going into foreign courts. They were getting judgments against U.S. publishers, and that was going to be silencing the U.S. publishers. And Congress decided to stand up for that and passed a law to take care of it. And what's important about the law, the Speech Act, is that in Congress, in the House of Representatives, every Republican and every Democrat voted for that. In the Senate, it was unanimous. Every Republican and every Democrat voted for that. They all stood up for a free press. That was only 9 years ago. We haven't come that far. I think we can get back there because, one of the things I think has been unfortunate is some of my colleagues, some of the people who feel the way I do, sort of treating a belief in freedom of the press as a liberal value. It wasn't that long ago it was a liberal value, it was a conservative value because it was an American value. And that to me is what we need to find.
So kind of a related, we have another.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yep. Please.
Sorry. So you mentioned social media and kind of like the misinformation spread through the internet and almost kind of without legal consequence. Could there ever be a potential regulation or debate about maybe like fact-checking software or some sort of thing before misinformation like gets posted or things like that? Like just to prevent the spread of misinformation?
It's a really good question, and that is about fake news on the internet. Is there anything that can be done? And I am going to not surprise you by coming out against regulation. I really don't think it should be the government dealing with free speech. That said, I think there's a lot more the platforms can do, and there's a lot more we can do. I think the kind of things you're talking about, whether it's using artificial intelligence to help find fake news and label it, but understand it is a very complicated topic, both what you do about it and what its effect is. The studies have not been, the studies are a little ambiguous about whether, in fact, fake news is believed or not, and what its effect is. And it's also just hard to figure out how to address it without regulation. And I'll just give you the example. When Facebook started labeling things as fake, they couldn't keep up with it. So what happens is that people assume if it's not labeled fake, it must be true, when all it actually meant was Facebook didn't find it yet. So it's a tough topic, but I'm not in favor of regulation. Yes?
Another question? Please.
So do you think the transition from traditional journalism in favor of what I would call shock news, if it bleeds, it leads type news, is due to, because I've often had a hypothesized that a lot of it is due to media owners who aren't in the, they aren't journalists, they're more about business owners making money. Do you think that's why we have sort of strayed away from traditional journalism, ethical journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things are going on here. One is that rich people have long owned the media in the United States. Go back to the 1890s. You have the owners who were essentially extremely rich and using it as a way to further enrich themselves. I think what's happened, though, is that I think I think journalism took its eye off the ball, and the pursuit of clicks became a thing. Whether that's cat videos or whatever, the attempt to get readers became very important as the financial circumstances of newspapers got worse and worse. I think the good news is that I think most people are now convinced that the pursuit of clicks is not the way for local journalism to survive, that what is going to be the survival of local journalism, one of the things, is quality journalism, and that people are going to have to pay more for it, and they're only going to pay more for it if it's quality. So I'm hopeful that local journalism will get back to doing quality as sort of its main goal in life.
I was just going to ask a quick follow-on.
Sure.
So how can low-level, even young journalists like us who are coming into the business, what can we do to help facilitate that?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that helps is to use the data that's available to show that quality journalism gets rewarded. That we now, when I was in journalism many years ago, we always thought we knew what readers wanted. We didn't know what readers wanted. We just speculated what we saw. But now you actually have that data, and I think that anytime you can use the data to show that quality topics, quality writing, in-depth storytelling works, you should be calling that to the attention of editors and owners.
Well, I guess we're out of time. I was going to ask one more question, but I'll just take us back to the book, because you've described your book as a love story about many things, but certainly about your love for the First Amendment. There are many great passages in there. I selected one that I was going to read, but in the interest, well, I can read it real quickly. You say, "The law can only do so much. It can give the press the freedom to matter, but it can't make the press matter. Whether the press counted, whether it had a role to play, depended in the end on the will of the people. It doesn't really matter how much freedom the press has in a society if the press is not believed. A distrusted press is little different from a shackled press. It lacks the authority to mobilize public opinion against wrongdoing, corruption, and misguided policy. It has not the voice to hold governments accountable. It gets ignored." So the question is, how do we restore trust in the press?
And this will give me an opportunity to say what I hope I said at the beginning, but need repeated, is that I really thank the Cronkite School for having me. I really have been impressed today talking to students and talking to the faculty here. And what I see going on here is exactly what needs to be done. You know, there is a concern for the values that have meant so much to journalism: fairness, impartiality, getting the facts right, and I can see that's part of the culture. At the same time, you folks are really learning how to get that out to people, you know, because the power to distribute the news is so incredible. And I think it's harnessing those two things of doing quality journalism, doing it in a way that appeals to modern sensibilities, and also is designed to reach large audiences, the only way we're going to get there. So thank you.
David McCraw has been so generous with his time here. You can tell hearing him, he's someone who passionately cares about the press and what he does. Please join me in thanking David McCraw. Thank you.